Why do we need to breathe oxygen? And how does the food that we eat get turned into the energy that we need to power our lives? Well, the answer to both of these questions, surprisingly, is the same molecule, the wonder molecule, the universal energy currency known as ATP. Hey guys, Grayson here. Welcome to another Based Theory. Life can be described as a series of chemical reactions. All of life's processes can ultimately be broken down into chemical reactions. But when you think about all the life on the entire world, what do you think would be the most common chemical reaction? Some people might think of photosynthesis as that is the basis from which life gets all of its energy from, or most of it. But that's not the case. Actually, the most prevalent, ubiquitous chemical reaction in all of life is ATP synthesis. Everything that we do in life requires ATP. From moving your arm to thinking a thought to breathing to sleeping to eating to digesting to even your stomach growling burns ATP. Everything that we do as living beings burns ATP in the process. So that means that our bodies need to make a lot of ATP. In fact, the average human body produces its own body weight in ATP every single day. That's how much of it our bodies are going through every day just to be alive and do the things that we do. So, what is ATP? Well, it stands for adenosine triphosphate, and we're going to break down what that is because the A, adenosine, is basically the same A in the genetic code of A, C, T's, and G's. It's the same A, adenosine, the adenine plus a sugar. Then you have triphosphate, which means three phosphate groups. Now, each one of these phosphate groups is negatively charged. So you can think of it as a little bit like a spherical magnet that repels other magnets. So if you were to have three of these loaded onto the same molecule, right, that's a lot of repulsion, right? That you're going to be having to keep together. Now, they're kept together by the chemical bond. That last phosphate bond is very high energy to keep that negatively charged phosphate as a part of the ATP. And that last bond is very prone to breaking and transferring that third phosphate group to another receiving party like an enzyme, where the third phosphate can bind at a much lower energy state. In this process, whereby the ATP donates a phosphate group to like an enzyme, a protein, that is going to be accomplished with a lot of transfer of energy, right? That's almost like kinetic energy of that phosphate group moving very rapidly from the ATP to the receiver, and it's going to impart a lot of energy into that receiver. So for a lot of enzymes, whenever they have like taken that received that phosphate group from ATP, it's going to cause them to change shape. It's like literally like, you're shooting out a magnet. You hold three repelling magnets together, and then what happens when you move your hand? That last magnet shoots out. It's like that with the ATP and that third phosphate group. That phosphate group shoots out, binds with the enzyme, and changes its shape. It's like, getting shot. The enzyme will then undergo a conformational change. So remember, enzymes are like the protein machinery of a cell. They have jobs that they're doing, they're catalyzing reactions, and the way that they do that oftentimes is by actually physically changing shapes, right? They have like two or three shapes that they cycle between, and by changing those shapes, right, that's how they're doing their job. Just like a factory worker, they go through two positions, they've got the same kind of repetitive task that they're doing all the time. And so enzymes are the same way. But what powers them to do these repetitive tasks over and over and over again that are ultimately powering all of the activity in our cells and life itself is these interactions with ATP. ATP has to provide the energy. It's got to shoot that phosphate group out, and it's got to activate the enzymes so that they can do their job. So ATP very effectively stores the chemical energy that we get from the food that we eat. It stores it in that last phosphate bond. It's like a spring pulled back on a pinball machine, you know? It is ready to impart that energy elsewhere to power the cellular processes. But creating ATP, actually taking, ADP, which is the same molecule but with only two phosphate groups, and loading that third phosphate group onto it, that takes a lot of energy. We already said that's a very high energy bond. ATP is not very stable on its own. It wants to shoot that third phosphate group out. Those negative charges are repelling. So it requires a lot of energy to create this ATP in the first place. But like we already said, it's the number one most common chemical reaction in all of life. So how does that happen? Well, all of the food that we eat is ultimately broken down, and the carbon is fed into the citric acid cycle, which spits out carbon dioxide. So all of the carbon that we eat, it ultimately is turned into carbon dioxide by a series of chemical reactions. And as these chemical reactions are happening, what happens is that the high energy electrons are actually harvested out of these more complex carbon molecules on their way to becoming CO2. And these high energy electrons are harvested by molecules. They're put onto molecules that are called electron donors, and that's just because, similar to the way that ATP will donate that high energy phosphate group, these molecules, these electron donors, are prone to donating that high energy electron. So they actually will donate this electron into a series of protein complexes in the membrane. So they kind of pass the electron between them, like a hot potato, right? And every single time that electron is going from a higher energy to a lower energy state. So it's as it goes through this process from electron donor to electron to receiver, getting donated and received each step along the way, it's actually shedding excess energy that can be used to do work. And the way that our cells actually harness this energy is to pump positively charged protons, like hydrogen ions, outside of the membrane. You see, because we all know how concentration gradients work, and things flow from high concentration to low concentration, right? So the cell has to maintain these concentration gradients in order for it to function. So it needs more protons outside the membrane than inside the membrane. So it has to do this by harnessing these high energy electrons from the food we eat, passing them through this process from the electron donor to the electron receiver. And as it goes through that process, that energy is used to continuously pump these protons against their concentration gradient. The protons want to normally flow into the cell because it's high concentration outside, low concentration inside. So it takes a lot of energy to pump them out of the cell. And the key to this process is ultimately the oxygen that we breathe. You can think of oxygen a little bit like the ultimate electron acceptor, right? The electron can exist at a very low energy state when it's bound to oxygen. So oxygen is willing to accept lots of different electrons because most electrons are higher energies than they would be with oxygen. So ultimately, the key that is driving this entire electron transport chain that we've been talking about is oxygen, right? That's why it's known as an oxidizing agent. Because electrons are negatively charged, if you receive an electron, you are being reduced, right? Because your charge is being reduced, it's becoming more negative. And if you donate that electron, you are a reducing agent. That's why oxygen is known as an oxidizing agent, because it oxidizes things by stripping them of their electrons. That's why this entire electron transport train that we've been talking about is known as a series of redox reactions, reduction oxidation reactions. It's a core concept in chemistry, but it's simple when you just think of it in terms of who's receiving the electron and who's donating the electron. And in the case of our metabolism, the reason why we need to continuously breathe oxygen is because we need something to actually receive these electrons. So we will inhale the oxygen, right? And then it will be reduced by the electrons as part of this energy process, and ultimately it will bond with some of the protons and become water. So far, we haven't really harnessed any energy. We've taken the food that we eat and the oxygen we breathe, and ultimately we have produced a proton gradient. That means we've gotten more protons outside of the membrane than within the membrane. But how can we use that? Well, enter in a molecular motor called ATP synthase. Now, this works a little bit like a water wheel. Remember, we said that the protons want to flow from high concentration to low concentration. So the protons outside all want to cross that membrane and all want to go to the lower concentration within the membrane. So if you have a little tiny hole where they can all flow, right? And then you have a little water wheel next to it that's going to be turning as they flow, right? The same way that a water wheel turns as the water falls and flows through it and turns the wheel. This is going to power a molecular motor that's actually going to take the ADP, right? Because of the power of this spinning wheel, it can actually have the conformational change without binding to ATP, right? Its conformational change comes from the spinning of that wheel from the protons flowing across the membrane. So it uses that energy to actually have the conformational changes to take ADP, remember ATP with only two phosphates, and take that third phosphate and bring them together and make that high energy bond in the first place to create ATP. And this is the process that's going on trillions of times a day in your body. And the molecular machinery involved in each step along this process of ATP synthesis is some of the most conserved in all of life. It's ubiquitous. Everything in life, from the most ancient archaea to modern humans and every animal species and plant in between, all uses ATP and all uses some form of ATP synthesis. Now, there are some slight differences between all the different ATP synthase motors, and it does allow us to kind of reconstruct a phylogenetic tree of life that can show us about evolutionary pathways of life. But they don't show us much information about how the ATP process, the ATP synthesis process, actually evolved in the first place. And that's because it's so ubiquitous. Everything uses it. In the hypothetical last universal common ancestor, the LUCA, ATP synthesis is already in place as a basic mechanism. In fact, the ATP synthase motor is, alongside with the ribosome, the most ancient molecular motors known to science. So what do we actually know about how ATP evolved in the first place? Well, the answer is that the science is still very much in its infancy, but we do have some important insights. Namely, like I said before, the A in ATP is actually the same A from the genetic code. And if you look at the process by which DNA and RNA is made, you'll see that it requires ATP. Not only that, but the T requires TTP. The C requires CTP. Each one requires a triphosphate of the nucleoside. And this would seem to imply that ATP is necessary as already having been in place as a staple of the molecular machinery of these first forms of life before DNA. Because remember, ATP is a necessary building block for DNA. Now, one of the two main big camps of abiogenesis, origin of life research, is metabolism first. And that's the hypothesis that life would have begun not with some sort of DNA or RNA based replicating machinery, but would have started with a series of chemical reactions that would form a metabolism of kinds that was not necessarily restricted to within a cell. There are several different sub-theories within the metabolism first umbrella, but the key feature being that these networks of interlocking chemical reactions, which is ultimately basically what life still is anyway, but in a much more simple early state, would have been what's known as autocatalytic. That means they catalyze their own reaction, which is like a chemical version of reproduction. Now, whether ATP was a fundamental part of these first chemical reactions of proto-life remains to be seen empirically. However, it's a very strong candidate considering how ubiquitous it is throughout all the various domains of life, how it's required in DNA and RNA synthesis in the first place, and how central it is to every single task that is performed by enzymes, proteins, all the most of the chemical reactions that make life possible are powered by ATP. So there are more unknowns than knowns in the evolution of ATP. But one thing seems fairly evident, and that's that ATP most likely predates DNA in the history of life and abiogenesis. So, guys, thanks for watching. This was a fun one to do. I know that this was the winner of the poll that I made for what topic that you guys most want to see. So I'm very curious down in the comments to hear your thoughts about the video, the topic, what interested you in this topic, what did you get out of the video. And I thought that the poll was really a lot of fun, and I think I want to do another one for the next based theory. So keep your eyes peeled for that poll. I think it's really fun to let you guys pick the topics that are most interesting to you out of the options. So I'll keep some of the better performing ones, and then for some of the ones that didn't do as well, I'll put some new options there just to make it fresh and fun for everybody. So keep your eyes peeled, keep voting in those polls, and like and share, and your subscriptions really mean a lot for me. I just passed 300 subs. So thank you to everyone that subscribes. It means a ton. Thank you very much, guys.